Hi everybody, this is Coffee, and this is going to be Policing Ecology 3, where I'm going to deal with PTSD. Now, there's two forms of PTSD, and this one right here is post-traumatic stress disorder, which most people are familiar with. What is this? PTSD in this format means that you have undergone something in your life that has caused a permanent psychological impact on your well-being. So it could be something as severe as having a mortar shell explode next to you, so you become shell-shocked, or losing friends in combat, or it can be something as mundane as getting attacked by a dog when you were little, so therefore you have a fear of dogs for the rest of your life, and seeing a dog causes you to go into all sorts of spasms or makes you lock up and that sort of stuff. Now, the one that people actually don't know of, and I have yet to see any DSM deal with this exactly, which is Perpetual Traumatic Stress Disorder, which police actually go through constantly. Now, right off the bat, post-traumatic means after. So the event has already occurred. It's not continuously occurring. The difference is with Perpetual Traumatic Stress Disorder is that officers are constantly undergoing stresses where they're dealing with possibly violent individuals, people that commit crimes, and a lot of internal dynamics which cause them to go through those stress valleys and peaks constantly. Now, how does this affect your body? Well, there's something called hypervigilance. Now, I didn't make this up. Hypervigilance is coined by Dr. Gil Martin, who created a book called Police Officer Emotional Survival. Good book, get it. So with hypervigilance, the process is when you're going through stress, your body amps up all of its resources. It begins to use more energy to release adrenaline and what other hormones you need to have a better reaction towards your stressors. So therefore, you get more blood to everywhere, so you can process information faster as it comes to you. I can react in a certain situation more efficiently when I'm geared towards it, when I'm stressed, versus if I'm just in code white, like fluffy bunny mode. So hypervigilance, the actual neurochemical process, is that your brain, and this is, I know this looks like a nose, but what this is right here is this is your body's way of releasing dopamine. So these are little dopamine channels right here. These little dots are dopamine, and they get released into these receptors. You see the arrows. So whenever you have a stressor, your body reacts by releasing dopamine. So the dopamine goes down in there, and it creates a feeling of well-being. In order for you to maintain your activity. Because if you didn't have this, you would be racked with pain constantly for the most minor things, and you could face all sorts of problems like depression, mania, etc. So this is what your body does to counteract that. So with policing and hypervigilance, this happens constantly. And if you know anything about neurobiology, the result of this is that when you start dumping dopamine constantly, your body starts to reject it. So therefore, you're not getting the same level of the high that you would the first time. And through hypervigilance, it causes conditioning of the brain to cope with stressful situations through release of dopamine. Now, this conditioning right here is a problem because when you're constantly undergoing stressful events, this no longer works as it should have the first time because you're burning out the receptors. Now, from the research that I've done, I was looking at PubMed journals throughout the week regarding this. I have yet to find anything to say that this damage is reversible. You can supplement it with medication and that sort of stuff to balance out your moods and whatnot, but from what I've read, this process is permanent, which is a problem. So if there's any neurobiologists out there, anybody who studies neuroscience, etc., feel free to chime in on this and correct me if I need it. So when we go here, now, when you're going through this, it creates the well-being. So you can create an addiction to conflict. Now, what's the addiction to conflict? Well, this gets released through stressors. Now, the stressors in police work are most typically through conflict with an individual. You have to fight with somebody, or you show up on scene and you have to diffuse an argument where people are screaming at each other. Nobody calls us out there to have cookies and tea. That just doesn't happen. So we're out there to resolve problems. All we see is the negative typically. So the hypervigilance is constant, this dopamine release is constant, and then the conditioning causes us to have an addiction to conflict. So what that means is when an officer has a certain amount of time on the job and is experiencing a lot of this conflict, they're addicted to that feeling. So when they're off duty, they don't get it, or when they're not in conflict, they don't get it. So therefore, they become depressed, and they get these feelings of anxiety, or etc. So they have to relate back to this. So, as a quick example, I was watching the Young Turks, and they had a video on a Philly PD officer who basically lost his shit when he was dealing with two individuals. I think it's South Philly, where the ghetto is. And so he was dealing with two guys, and he lost it. He was screaming at them, blaming them for the world's problems, etc. Now, they railroaded him on the Young Turks, saying it's his fault and he's bad and everything else like that. And you had some talking head on there who was completely cracked. But nobody wants to take into account that all of this occurred. So the neurochemical imbalance right here, which happened because of the Perpetual Traumatic Stress Disorder, caused him to react in this manner. I'm not absolving him from blame completely, but I'm saying that we have to analyze the underlying causes of this. And what this pattern does, this constant conditioning, is it teaches you to be a hammer. And when you're a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So an officer who is facing these or deals with this constantly has no other choice but neurochemically to follow that pattern, because they have become an addict of that feeling, an addict of this neurochemical imbalance. So it's like with heroin addicts when they say they're chasing the dragon, because they're chasing that subconsciously. Now, what is the ultimate end product of this addiction and these problems here? First off, it's CNS exhaustion. Your CNS is your central nervous system. It regulates everything. Without it, you would be dead. More or less, this regulates all of your hormones, your processes throughout your body. When this is exhausted, your body cannot efficiently deal with things like oxytocin and regulate your feelings, your hormones, etc. With that being exhausted, that's a big problem, because now you're giving somebody who is mentally imbalanced the ability to go out there and use force as necessary to effect an arrest, and giving them a weapon. And we're running into conflict here, as you can see right off the bat. Physical exhaustion is also a factor of it. Now, people will say, like command staff who don't know any better, etc., they'll say things like, well, that's why you take a vacation, and etc. And things that a vacation is not going to remedy these two issues or the underlying causes of perpetual traumatic stress disorder. It just basically delays it. So an officer can start to go back and start to heal, and then they get dumped right back to the situation. And that is potentially even more dangerous, because when you have somebody go, if they're at this high end and they start to taper off, basically, they're going to have that huge rebound back as soon as they get there. So they're going to kick right back into that system, and it's going to be an explosive response. The third thing which I touched on earlier is that there is the possibility for permanent neurochemical imbalance. Now, the destruction of the receptors for dopamine, is a big issue, because once that happens, this person is broken. They will never be the same unless they can do receptor replacement therapy, which I think is still experimental at this stage, and it should never get to that level to start with. So when a person goes through this neurochemical imbalance, then they start to experience things like panic attacks and depression, mania, schizoidal disorders, and hyperaggression. Panic attacks, everybody knows what that is. But it's not just like, oh, my world's coming to an end. A panic attack is accompanied by difficulty breathing. Your senses go into overdrive. You basically go into hypervigilance, into condition black, as it's called. So all your senses are firing constantly, and you go into this manic state where you lose it. So that's what a panic attack is. It's not just, So when people scoff at that, it's something that people should analyze, is that, well, it might be trivial to us that somebody's going through that problem of a panic attack for a barking dog or whatever else, but to them, it feels like the world is ending, so take it into consideration. Depression, that's an easy one. But depression is not something where, like, oh, I feel sad. Depression is, I don't want to get out of bed because I have no energy. Not that I want to go, eat my gun or go listen to some sad music and jump off the roof. So mania is the opposite of depression. These two can be combined into bipolar disorder, but mania is like Robin Williams, all over the place. Schizoidal disorders. these issues right here can actually make you crack up by like schizophrenic, so where you hallucinate and you're done. So, and hyperaggression. Back to the Philly PD officer as an example, that's what this is manifesting as, this hyperaggression. And there was a more recent one which I read where this officer lost his mind over something as trivial as somebody giving him the finger when he was off duty. And so to chase the dragon and to get back, see things as a hammer, to get to this right here, the initial high, this officer off duty in his vehicle, in his actual RMP, engages a civilian in a process of conflict, and it erupted and it turned violent. So the officer was wrong in every aspect. But the thing we have to take into account is that this was never addressed and never dealt with. So while the officer does have culpability in this, his neurochemistry was patterned to this exact response right here. So how do we deal with this sort of stuff? Well, I got to erase all this wonderful information right here and put up the how to recognize it and that sort of stuff. It'll take me a little bit, and then we'll be right back.